I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. Julian Leeser's decision this week to quit as Shadow Attorney-General and Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians may not have come as a complete surprise. The long-time supporter of an Indigenous Voice simply couldn't stay in the role after the Liberal Party decided to oppose a constitutionally enshrined advisory body. Most Liberals are happy with backing the no case, but some leading moderates remain in an uncomfortable position. After losing his frontbencher, Peter Dutton went straight to Alice Springs, a town plagued by violence. The opposition leader wants more police sent in and doesn't think a voice will help. But he has been urged to go to the police himself after making some alarming allegations. Later in the program, I'll be joined from Alice Springs by the Country Liberal Party Senator for the Northern Territory, Jacinta Price. But first, the panel: Karen Middleton, Jack Lattimore and Claire Armstrong. Let's talk about Peter Dutton going to Alice Springs first up. Claire, why did the opposition leader go? What was he hoping to achieve?
Well, this is, I think, at least is his second visit this year. I think he was there at the end of last year as well. He goes to Alice Springs for a number of reasons, the main one being he feels it is a place that from which he can galvanise his position, that the Voice is everything that Alice Springs doesn't need. It's not going to be there fast enough, it's not going to be practical enough, it's not going to engage with the people in the community. He feels it's the place that's very recognisable to a lot of Australians as a place with a lot of issues around Indigenous affairs and other social problems. He goes there because he thinks it illustrates his point. Whether that's the case though, well, he didn't exactly have the greatest trip, I don't think.
Why do you say that?
Well, I mean, in the main, because he's now had to spend the last couple of days, or at least the opposition have had to spend the last couple of days defending the claims they've made around this exponential, rampant kind of increase of child sex abuse and other issues in the town, and hasn't really produced the data that suggests that's the case.
I want to get to some of that data in a minute, but Jack, you've written today that Peter Dutton is really following an old script when it comes to what he's doing in Alice Springs. What do you mean?
Well, we've seen it before, that's for certain. In 2007, in the lead up to the Northern Territory emergency response, the intervention, we've seen a lot of the similar sort of allegations as what Dutton has come forward.
Child sex abuse in particular?
Well, more specifically pedophile rings that were in operation within these remote Aboriginal communities. Now, none of those were ever substantiated, none of those allegations. An inquiry into sexual abuse in the Northern Territory heard anecdotally a few things. There was a few accounts in some Aboriginal remote communities. Within that report, it says that the most reliable of those accounts involved non-Indigenous minor workers, fly in, fly out, who were soliciting younger Aboriginal women with beads and trinkets, blankets, swags, things like that. That was the most reliable at that point. And then off the back, the Howard government ministers and stuff at the time really ran with that scenario. And off the back of that, we've seen, the military mobilised and the intervention roll out. Now, the intervention, as we know now, had some good aspects in terms of the ban on alcohol. And that's, we heard recently that, they've been re-implemented up there.
And seems to be working to the extent that the hospital data is showing a drop in the last few months of presentations that are alcohol-related violence, domestic violence and so on. Clearly there's still a violence problem on
Well, they still get
the
the grog as well. There's a private sale up there and people are buying.
I mean, even the local Labor MP, Marion Scrimgeour, Karen, she's saying there are way too many young people doing illegal things around Alice Springs, stealing cars, setting them on fire and so on. But she points out this has been building for years, not 12 months.
Yeah, it's not just a 12-month-old problem. It's a problem that's been around for a long, long time. And the intervention and the fact that the Howard government saw an opportunity to make a thing of that and to go into the Northern Territory suggests that the Northern Territory's had problems for a long time. It's a low socio-economic jurisdiction, so it's got a high Indigenous population, but people there don't earn as much as in other parts of the country. So there are a number of factors involved, and it isn't this clearly isn't a new problem, but it is a problem.
Yeah.
And the issue here is it a problem that's just being exploited for political reasons? And I think there's increasing evidence that it is being exploited for political reasons.
Well, particularly when Peter Dutton waded into the issues around child sex abuse, as you say, that's where things got a bit more contentious for him, because we also heard while he was there from the peak body for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children saying there is no evidence of an increase in child sex abuse.
What we definitively have not seen in the evidence and the data is an increase in child abuse, or in particular in child sexual abuse. It is not reflected in any of the data sets.
And that led to this question from a local ABC reporter.
What evidence do you have that there is this so-called rampant child sexual abuse occurring in remote central Australia?
Well, with respect, that's such an ABC question. Do you live locally? Do you speak to people on the streets? Do you hear what it is they're saying to you? Do you believe...
I live locally.
You live locally. You don't believe there's any problem here?
No, I'm asking you, what evidence do you have that there is...
Well, I've spoken to the police and the social workers, some of whom are out on stress leave at the moment because of the scenes that they've endured. They have kids taking them back into homes where they've been sexually assaulted and 6-year-olds grabbing onto their legs, screaming not to be left there.
Now, that is a pretty alarming allegation, that 6-year-olds being dragged screaming back into the homes of where they've been abused. Do we know what he's talking about there, Claire?
Yeah, well, apart from what he's just said there about the kind of groups of people he's speaking to, there's not been specific cases. We then had Senator Malarndirri McCarthy, the Labor Senator for Northern Territory, come out and say, well, if Mr Dutton is aware of an incident like that, under mandatory reporting requirements, he should tell authorities. I think what the issue is around that, there was definitely and has definitely been a massive increase in criminal behaviour and antisocial behaviour in Alice Springs, but it is being talked about in very generalist terms lately that I think has become unhelpful, particularly in this instance where Peter Dutton chose to take offence at the question rather than engage and mount his own case.
It's not to say that child abuse isn't a particular problem in the Territory. I want to go to the data. This is what the Liberal Party themselves were pointing to later in the week. Data from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. It is actually this is for 2020-21. Now, of course, the Morrison government was in power at the time. Peter Dutton was Home Affairs Minister for most of that time. But have a look at it. What it shows, the age bracket under 1, you can see that big line on the right, the big brown line there is the Northern Territory. Compared to the other states, you can see this is for substantiated child abuse notifications. So for babies under 1, it's in the Northern Territory over 63 in every 1,000 that is subject of a substantiated notification, compared to the national average of about 16. For those aged 1 to 4, it's 26 in the Northern Territory. The national figure is about 9. Look, the Institute does point out, however, I need to note this, there are differences in the way states and territories report data. The NT has the strictest mandatory reporting, so it says the data is not comparable, but I do think it gives us still a bit of an indication that there's obviously a particular problem there. It is also worth noting, though, that not all of this is sexual abuse. In fact, the Institute says 55% is emotional abuse of children, 21% is neglect, 14% physical abuse, only 10% is sexual abuse, and in the Northern Territory it's actually closer to 5 or 6% of their overall abuse cases that are sexual abuse. I know there's a bit of a blizzard of data there, but I do think the context is important here because, some have been cherry picking some of this data to make various points. But what does that tell us, Karen, do you think? There has long been a particular problem in the Territory.
Yeah, and as we said before, not enough has been done to address it, either clearly at the Territory government level, local government level and the national level. There's been a lot of talk about it. There've been announced national moves like the 2007 intervention, but what has the practical impact been? It hasn't been adequate. And so I think we all need to take responsibility for a problem like this. But I find it makes me uncomfortable when we start to deal with it in slices of information and to turn it into the platform for a political debate about an issue that is related, because there is an argument that the Voice would assist in addressing these things in the longer term, because we would be hearing directly from Indigenous people to government on what might work. And we've heard the argument that the problem here has been the changes of programs get cancelled by new governments, there's no consistency and not enough consultation. But it's being exploited, and I think that's the worry.
There's undoubtedly still a general violence problem.
Yes.
You know, we know people are scared to go out at night and so on.
Yeah.
The government did in January announce some immediate funding of $48 million, and that has gone out the door already to various programs to help youths, to help night patrols. $250 million was then promised, and they're still working out exactly how that's going to be spent. I think in the next couple of weeks we'll see. But is this, Jack, enough? And does it look like the money's going to the right areas, or is there a need for more?
I think it's probably enough to get it established, but it takes a while to establish the sorts of services, and not just to fund them to bankroll them, to roll out, but also for the uptake in community and for the effect in community. So yeah, there's a clear issue with youth crime up there. No one's denying that.
What about the idea of sending in federal police? This is what Peter Dutton's been saying.
I would also just add a couple of points. That the measures, that the reintroduction of the alcohol restrictions, similar to the Stronger Futures legislation that lapsed last year, lots of people in the community were calling for that as a circuit breaker. So as much as there has been a response from the federal government, it was okay, let's bring the temperature down a little bit in Alice and have a more meaningful discussion about how we respond. I don't think that, as you say, that money hasn't been allocated. I don't think that's happened yet, and that's why we are still seeing these issues in Alice. And I would also we should have flagged that on the issue of the child sexual abuse sort of question, Peter Dutton is calling for a Royal Commission into that, which would answer, theoretically, some of the questions we have about comparable data, the extent that we can rely upon that data. Obviously, there's a response from the community saying they don't want a Royal Commission, some do, but I think it's worth the flag that...
Yeah, I mean, some on the ground say that we've had so many inquiries, we know what needs to be done. But more immediately, suggesting federal police should go in. There are also some local concerns about prisons already being overcrowded. Is the answer just to keep locking up teenagers? Is that really going to fix this? I think the Northern Territory Police Commissioner has previously said we can't arrest our way out of this. But is it at that point that more boots on the ground is going to make a difference?
Well, this is the question, and I think we also remember that Mr Dutton brings a policeman's eye to this. He served as a police officer in Queensland. He's been very focused on child sexual abuse for a long time. He brings it up a lot. It was a big focus of his as Home Affairs Minister. He brought it up again when he became opposition leader in that news conference first, that he wants something to be done. And he did it in the context of the Voice. I'm frustrated, I want practical action. But again, the question is what has been done, and what are the proposed solutions alternative to the Voice and others? Now, the Voice is a longer term thing, but what is being proposed to do things now? And that's what we're not hearing enough of, I think. So there's another inquiry is one suggestion, maybe more police on the ground, but that is not going to address the reasons for the violence and the unrest and the family dislocation and alcohol abuse. There are reasons that these things occur, and that's what needs to be examined at the same time as seeking to address the impact of it on a community.
Well, time to explore some of that on the ground in Alice Springs. Time to talk to Senator Jacinta Price, and to take us there, here was the Assistant Minister for Indigenous Australians, Malarndirri McCarthy, on Peter Dutton's allegations of child abuse.
It is a very serious allegation to raise the abuse of a child, and a serious allegation to make that a child is being returned to an abuser. I would ask Opposition Leader Peter Dutton, if you are aware of this, then you need to mandatory report it to police so that there can be an investigation immediately.
Senator, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, David.
So are you aware of children being sexually abused and then returned to their abuser?
What I'm aware of, and being a long-term local, and somebody who's fought to be in the position that I am, because I'm acutely aware of the circumstances on the ground in a place like Alice Springs, is that I've been approached by many foster parents who are deeply concerned about the kinship rule when it comes to the foster care of vulnerable Indigenous children, that Territory families take children who have been in loving, caring foster homes and then place them back into communities that they've actually not really known all their lives. For example, there might be a child, a 6-month-old, put into the care of a foster family who then take care of that child, meet that child's needs in a suburban home in Alice Springs with everything that they require, paediatric support, specialist learning support, all of those things. And then by the time they turn 6 or 7, there might be somebody who says, I'm kin for this child, I will take responsibility for this child. So, but that person is living back out in a community that doesn't have the services available, where there's known predators in some of those communities, and those children have been re-traumatised, put back in those circumstances, and in fact, yes, sexually abused again, and then again, Territory family steps in once that's happened and put them back in foster care. I know this is happening. And these are the sorts of stories that Peter Dutton heard on his visit here. And while the media have turned this into a beat Peter Dutton up exercise, the truth remains he was here because of his concerns, because the community has been calling out for leadership to come and address these concerns. And while Peter Dutton has made 2 visits, the Prime Minister, I have to remind everyone, the Prime Minister made a 3-hour visit to Alice Springs and left and then spent 3 days at the tennis. Locals on the ground, if the media were in fact at all interested in understanding, were really very upset about feeling like they've been completely ignored. These issues have been issues that I have been campaigning on for a very, very long time, because the concerns of locals, they're beyond themselves right now, and they're calling on leadership in a bipartisan approach to address these issues. That's what's going on.
I want to come to how to address these issues, but just coming back to the question though, are there specific cases that Peter Dutton's talking about of kids being returned to the hands of their abusers?
This is what I'm saying. So these are the concerns of foster parents and people who have had these experiences. They have been through these experiences. So these aren't made up claims.
Do they need to be reported to police then?
They've gone through the processes. It is failings by Territory families to actually uphold the human rights of these children. And the basis of this is because they are Indigenous kids, and the priority is to put them with kin, even though that kin may be living in dysfunctional circumstances. This has been an ongoing issue, but one where you can't put a spotlight onto unless you have a royal commission, because the fact that foster parents, their stories cannot be heard publicly. It's about protecting the identity of these children.
I'll come to the Royal Commission,
but this is what happens.
Sticking with the immediate concern for kids, does Peter Dutton, or indeed yourself, Senator, need to report any of this to police? Are there kids right now who are being put in danger?
Look, David, we're not stupid. Peter Dutton is a former policeman. He knows what needs to be done. I'm talking about circumstances where these things have taken place, where Territory families has known about these circumstances. Oh, well, if that's what the territory families know about them, I'm assuming that they have reported that. I know foster parents have. They've done the due diligence and they have done the reporting in these circumstances.
But are you just assuming that this has been reported? Shouldn't you, under the mandatory reporting requirements laws, report this to police to make sure?
David, what I'm saying is, this is what has been done. The problem isn't this, the reporting's been done. The problem is the way in which the system is failing these children by putting them back in these circumstances. I mean, we're talking about situations where some of these foster parents are actually police themselves. This is the problem. They're fighting a system where they know that they're very concerned because Territory families are against recommendations and advice from experts such as paediatricians, child psychologists are saying to them, do not put these children back in these dysfunctional circumstances, and yet are doing that.
Who's making that call? Is that Territory families? That's just so viewers are aware. Are you suggesting Territory families are putting kids in the hands of abusers? I mean, that's a very serious allegation.
That's right, and this is what foster parents have been telling me. This is what foster parents have been telling me, and I have no reason to believe that these concerned parents are making these stories up, especially when I've heard them over and over again.
And are you passing any of that on to police?
Of course. Like I said, there are circumstances where foster parents themselves are, in fact, police. And I'm talking about foster carers who are also Indigenous, who have come to me with these grave concerns. So this is why we need a Royal Commission into the sexual abuse of Indigenous children.
Well, let me ask you about that. So
we can't deny the fact that...
Sorry, you've been talking about this for years, right, about the problems of violence there. Do you think another inquiry is really the best answer? Aren't there things that can happen now, should have happened by now?
Look, I think the inquiry is absolutely called for. It is absolutely called for because, as we're saying, you know, I'm being questioned, Peter's being questioned as to, you know, it's almost as if we're not being believed in this situation, that these parents are coming to us with these concerns. So therefore, an inquiry would in fact demonstrate that there are these foster parents out there who need to be heard for the sake of the children that they care for, because their voices are those that need to be heard with all of this. And you know, there's like this sense of shame or denial around Indigenous kids. It's like we can't talk about that. You know, they're not given the same reverence as someone like Grace Tame is given when they want to be heard, when they want their voices to be heard, because they're Indigenous kids. And somehow there's a shame that comes with that. We've got a sense of cover up that comes with that. I'm over it, to be quite honest.
Well,
I've had enough of it.
I think we're talking about it here this morning. So is there anything, though, in the absence of an inquiry that you think needs to happen on the ground?
Yes, I think we've also seen recently there's been articles in The Australian about a young man who wants to be adopted. I think the child protection system needs to change to stop this separatism of Indigenous kids being treated differently who aren't being removed because they're Indigenous, because authorities don't want to be seen as being racist because of the stigma of the stolen generation. And we need to uphold the human rights of children, Australian citizens in this country. And Indigenous kids deserve to have their human rights upheld. I mean, during Senate estimates, I asked the Human Rights Commissioner for Children what they were doing to uphold the human rights of these Indigenous children. She sat there dumbfounded without an answer. I mean, we are, as a society, ensuring the continued neglect and abuse of these kids because we're too afraid to step in and do something, and that needs to change.
So what right now needs to happen?
We need to remove the kinship aspect. We need to say that children who are living in circumstances where their human rights are being upheld should not be removed for the sake of putting children back with kin. Because I'm also aware of circumstances where there are some kin who know that there is money involved with raising a child, so they will put their hand up for the opportunity to have more money in their pocket and not necessarily provide that child with what they're the love and care they're supposed to have. I've heard many situations where that's happened, and these are all the things that we need to be taken into consideration.
That kinship requirement is, as I understand it, a preference. It's not about potentially putting a child in danger, is it?
It is the priority. It is what's seen as what should come above everything else. And I know of circumstances where children have been put in danger because of that provision.
What about what the federal government can do? I mean, you're in the federal parliament now. Do you agree the government is spending money in the right ways, that the money that's being put into night patrols, youth services, women's domestic violence support and so on, are these the right areas?
Look, I think the action plan, which that previously the coalition government had invested heavily into, the Centre for countering child exploitation, where the coalition government invested $70 million into, I think all of that is very valid, and we have always taken the bipartisan position to support that level of support, but it is incumbent upon, I think, state and territory governments to do the right thing when it comes to child protection. And if there was ever going to be, the only sort of referendum I would support right now is if we put the lives and the responsibility of children into the federal arena. That's a referendum I could get behind, because I think we absolutely need a review of how that is or isn't working across the board.
Running child protection.
Absolutely. If it's actually doing it from the perspective of upholding the human rights of our children, regardless of racial heritage in this country, then that's something I would support.
What about a local Indigenous voice? Would that help the situation in Alice Springs?
If those voices are prepared to actually be honest about the issue, as opposed to what we're seeing, we're seeing Snake, who was supposed to be the national representative body, trying to downplay this issue instead of recognising the sorts of things that I'm certainly been brought to my attention to tackle it from that particular direction. I mean, I'm interested in people who are interested in the truth as to what's going on.
So a local Indigenous voice,
embarrassed or stigma.
Do you support the idea of a local Indigenous voice?
So I support the idea of regional and remote legislated bodies that would represent issues going on the ground. That's what I would support. That is what the coalition supports going forward.
And exclusively Indigenous voices you're talking about there?
That's the idea. That's the idea.
Okay, because you have been warning, since your first speech in Parliament, about the Indigenous voice giving powers to one group of people based on race, driving a wedge between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, but you do think local and regional Indigenous voices are okay?
So what I have advocated for is, I don't believe in separating us along the lines of race within our Constitution. What I have always advocated for is the voices of people in remote and regional communities to be amplified. Because of the circumstances in those regional remote communities are very different to other communities. Someone from somewhere like Balgo, Docker River, Yuendamu, Indigenous voices from there are very different to Indigenous voices from suburban Sydney or Brisbane or even Alice Springs. And their voices in the bush are often not heard, are not amplified in these discussions. Even more so, the vulnerable voices in those communities are not heard. But it is often those with the loudest voice who can exert the most aggression who are heard.
Okay, if you had all these local and regional voices for the communities you're talking about, how would they be heard in Canberra? Do you need a national voice, a legislated national voice at least?
As I said, I support voice bodies that are representative of those regional remote areas. As I've said previously, in my work with the Centre for Independent Studies,
to funnel their views through to Canberra.
Their voices would go to Canberra, as far as I'm concerned, from the grassroots
through a national
to
voice?
Canberra, through those regional voices. Direct to Canberra through those regional and remote voices. That's what I would support, because as I've outlined in my research in the Centre for Independent Studies, the gap exists between remote communities and the rest of Australia, including the cities where there are services available to all people, including those of Indigenous heritage in those places.
This question of having a national voice. Your Liberal Senator colleague Karen Little says there would need to be a national voice to allow those regional voices to speak to Canberra. Do you agree or disagree with that?
So what I'm agreeing with is that I support voices from regional and remote communities to be heard in Canberra. That's what I support. That's what I've always supported.
How does that work?
That's what I've always fought for. Well, the coalition government, the previous coalition government made a commitment of $32 million to do prepared work to create that.
Right.
To create that. So that hasn't been done, obviously. But that was also based on the Kalmar-Langdon report. And the emphasis for us is about amplifying the regional and remote voices who aren't heard over the top of those that are already being heard from urban parts of this country and the cities.
Just a final one, Senator. Do you think we need in Australia to have a minister or indeed a shadow minister for Indigenous Australians?
I'd say so.
And why is that?
Well, ultimately, that's supposed to be the voice that represents Indigenous Australians. And I guess our Minister for Indigenous Australians just the other night witnessed firsthand the violence in Darwin when she assisted a stabbing victim who then later passed away. And, you know, perhaps maybe that is what will actually drive the Prime Minister to do something about the situation going on the ground in the Northern Territory.
And would you like to be
role.
as far as the shadow role goes, we heard you earlier in the week, you've had some conversations with Peter Dutton about it. Where's that at? Are we likely to see you take on that job?
Well, that's a decision for Mr. Dutton and for the leadership. No matter where I'm at in Parliament, I'll be doing what I can to advocate for the vulnerable, as I have done. So, and working hard is all I'm interested in doing, no matter what role that might entail.
All right, we will see. Senator Jacinta Price, appreciate your time this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's get back to our panel. We're joined once more by Karen Middleton, Jack Lattimore and Claire Armstrong. Do you think, Claire, we might have just heard from the new Shadow Minister? There's a bit of talk she might alternatively be given some special envoy type role. What's the latest mail on that?
Well, obviously, she's had these discussions with Peter Dutton. She's been very vocal on these issues. She's also a first-term senator, as is the other Indigenous member of the coalition party room, Karen Little. So at this point, I think it's pretty safe to say that in this reshuffle that's been prompted by Julian Leeser moving to the backbench, my understanding is there'll be some kind of role. If it's not the shadow ministry, there'll be maybe an assistant position or, as you say, an envoy. Karen,
it was pretty clear that Jacinta Price supports local and regional voices, but it didn't sound like she supports the idea of a national body. However, because you wrote an interesting piece on this yesterday, what did the Liberal Party actually agree to?
Well, this is a very interesting point, and I credit our colleague James Campbell from News Corp Papers with originally highlighting this issue. But on the day that the party room was held, it wasn't Julian Leeser who spoke to the proposal. Normally the Shadow Minister would be the one, if there's a policy decision to be taken, to speak to the proposal. He didn't. He remained silent. It was Peter Dutton who spoke to the proposal, and a piece of paper was circulated with 3 points on it that the party room was being asked to support. Firstly, that there be no constitutionally enshrined voice. Secondly, that there be constitutional recognition, that they supported that. And thirdly, a sort of two-part proposal that there be local and regional support for local and regional voices and support for a national voice, and both of those things would be legislated.
Just to underscore that, a national voice.
So the paper that was circulated with the proposals included a national voice. It said local and regional, point 3, local and regional voices and a national voice, but that would be legislated so the Parliament could abolish it if it wanted to.
Then what happened?
Well, that's what was supported in the party room. That's what people left the party room thinking they had endorsed. Some people went out and said as much. Peter Dutton then gave his news conference a short time later, and that final aspect of that final point just disappeared, and he started saying, we don't support a Canberra voice. Now, that confused a number of people from his own party room who thought they had supported a national voice but only legislated. But his position has been much more hardline. Some of them then had to go out and walk back what they'd said publicly, and there is still some confusion within the party, the Liberal Party,
on
about
this idea of a
what they're
national
actually
voice.
supporting.
Claire?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so Senator Andrew Bragg actually put out a statement noting what had been decided in the party room, and it did, in that first version, have the national body. I actually I got the first question to Dutton at that press conference. I think I was just sitting in the front, and first thing I asked was, how do all of your local and regional bodies talk to Canberra, where decision-making and funds come from? And he really, that would have been an opportunity then at the very start of the press conference to clarify it, and he didn't. And deep into the answer, he kind of conceded there must be some kind of structure. That was as close as he got to talking about how you could funnel whatever amazing grassroots information you get into Parliament.
Bottom line, he doesn't want to get bogged down, right, on this whole question of their alternative.
Well, it becomes degrees, right? If he's opposing something and his proposal sounds pretty much like what is being proposed.
And he wants to criticise a Canberra voice, and you can't do that if you're proposing a national voice.
A national voice of some
which
type.
Would be speaking to the people in Canberra.
Julian Leeser, who did step down as the Shadow Minister, he does support a constitutionally enshrined voice. He always has. He still wants changes to the wording. But even if that doesn't happen through the course of this parliamentary inquiry, I mean, he's made his position very clear.
I believe the time for the voice has come. I believe in local and regional voices. I believe in a national voice drawn from local and regional bodies, and I will support the referendum being put this year. I believe that the voice can help move the dial on Indigenous education, health, housing, safety and economic development.
Jack, do you think he had much choice, given his background on this?
Who's that?
Julian Leeser.
No, he was always going to support it. I mean, I think he did it well in terms of for the party, just going to the back bench where he can, have his position. I think we'll see a lot more of the Liberal Party members of Parliament do that. And as we know, there's 4 or 5 that are already made, their positions clear. I think as more speak out, we'll see more. I'm still a bit baffled. From what I heard then from Senator Price, it sounds as though she supports a voice.
She supported the regional and local voices.
That's where it starts, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So,
do you think that's consistent with her argument that this is driving a wedge, this is dividing us on race?
No,
Can you hold that view
not.
and still support regional and local voices?
So, sorry, I didn't mean to. Anne Homey was the constitutional law expert, was asked about this on Friday at the first hearing, and she talked about how we direct policies toward, and we make policies around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples all the time, and having them acknowledged in the Constitution isn't about defining them by their race. It's about acknowledging the unique position they have in the country as First Australians.
Well, she said that,
and that's what's required to have an Indigenous Australians minister. That's what's required to have AB study so that Indigenous kids can go to university. So if you accept the premise that we legislate on this issue all the time, you cannot say that that doesn't hold for a voice.
And the thing that underpins all of that, David, is it's a very sad fact. We are divided by race. We are divided by race now because all the statistics show us that on life expectancy, on education, on health, on income, Indigenous people are at the bottom in this country. And that shows you we are divided by race. Unofficially, but all of the policies have contributed, and generations of attitudes to Indigenous people have contributed to this situation. So we are divided. The question is, how are we going to address that?
And the Constitution has always identified race. We've, been excluded in the Constitution. It mentioned Aboriginal people up until recently. I just see that as part of the promotional.
The difficulty there was that was being used to make policies to the detriment, further detriment of Indigenous people. That's where the controversy about the race power has come in.
How's the whole issue playing at the moment in Indigenous communities, Jack?
It varies. Within regional and remote communities, and I've said this a number of times before, there is aspirational support for it. You ask regular, normal, Aboriginal people, and they say, yeah, aspirationally, that's what we want. What you also hear from the majority of people that you ask is that they want something that's got some teeth to it. So removing, there's a real issue about, removing that being able to speak to the executive. And I think while they're thrashing it around in the inquiry, that's worth exploring. The wording's worth, I think most Aboriginal people would welcome it being stress tested. Well, that's come up with the best thing, because
that's what this inquiry is about right now, right?
Is that we also heard from Aboriginal people that they don't want this to be a divisive thing.
Right.
These are people in community. They're not.
Well, just on that, right? So the first day of the hearings for this inquiry were on Friday. Former High Court judges, various constitutional academics lined up. Most of them are comfortable with the wording. A couple of them still want changes. And Toomey, who you've mentioned, leading constitutional expert. Look, I found this interesting. There are Liberals who are inclined to support the voice but want tighter wording. They would like executive government removed from the proposal. That's not going to happen. But in particular, taking something that's already in the explanatory memorandum for the legislation, which says there's no obligation to consult the voice on the part of government, putting that in the wording of the Constitution would make them happier. Look, Anne Toomey says she doesn't particularly have a problem with those sorts of changes, but she points out the risk in making that sort of change.
Could you tweak the words just a little bit, and would it make it better? I mean, for example, I have no objection to putting in the words that Professor Craven was so concerned about being, and the effects of its representations. Yeah. I have no problem with putting that in. I don't think it overly complicates the legislation. I personally have no objection about that. But again, you do still need to maintain the support of your Indigenous constituency, because if they're opposed to it, then that in itself is likely to kill the referendum. So that's where the political balance lies.
And Jack, that's it, isn't it? It's a political balance, right?
It's a delicate balance.
Yeah. But you're saying even if there was a bit of a tweak to keep some Conservatives happy, well, it might be okay?
There's a lot of Aboriginal people in community that are lean towards conservatism. Just as many, as there are that are considered to be more progressive or radical. So it is a balance there in the political sense, but it's also the balance within, the Aboriginal community to come up with that. And that's absolutely what we heard, is that, from a lot of elders, we don't want this to be a divisive thing, but by the same token, we don't just want a toothless machine in there that doesn't do anything. The biggest fear really is the construction of a Canberra or a voice that creates a level of bureaucracy. But that's not what anyone has ever said about this for probably 2 decades now. It needs to start at local and regional and remote levels, and then that informs a composite that sits in Canberra to get in the ear of ministers and policymakers.
Look, we are running out of time, and there's a couple other things this week that I just want to touch on. One is aged care. The government, as we know, Labor, before the election, promised what the Royal Commission recommended, 24/7 registered nurses in aged care, but they wanted to do it earlier than the Royal Commission was recommending, so from July of this year. This week, Wesley Mission announced 3 of their centres in Sydney are going to have to close. About 200 residents are going to have to be put elsewhere. Karen, the opposition says Labor's to blame for this. Did Labor underestimate how difficult this might be for aged care centres?
Maybe. I mean, the nursing staff in aged care are paid less than they're paid in hospitals, and then they're paid under the NDIS. So there's a problem of equity there that makes that a less attractive option for nursing staff. It's very hard work. It's very important, but it's hard work. So there's a staffing problem we know across the board in Australia in the wake of the shutdowns through the pandemic. So there's that issue. I think part of the problem we now face, and there's some confusion around this, is there's this sort of July deadline being set. Now the government and the Minister Annika Wells is saying, oh, don't worry, we're not going to actually close you down if you can't meet that. But it is set as a deadline.
It's in law.
And so there is a sort of a legal obligation from these nursing homes to be able to meet that standard. So something's going to have to change in a more formal sense. Otherwise, they are in trouble if they can't meet the deadline.
What's going to give, do you think?
Well, I think the most reasonable response of the government would be to tinker with the regulations that already exempted about 5% of aged care homes. If they had 30 or less beds, or in really remote Australia, they could potentially lift that bar. The problem is the sector and others were raising their concerns about meeting this July 1 deadline within days of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announcing it in his last budget reply speech. So it's kind of unfortunate that it's taken now in the 11th hour to start to scramble to have to address this regulation issue.
Yeah. Also on the economy this week, we're getting more and more data leading up to the budget. All the global economic data looks very grim. And the Treasurer's been hearing about that in Washington. Locally, though, we've got jobs figures, jobs market still powering along despite the 10 interest rate rises. How difficult is this all shaping up for the Treasurer?
It's a complicated equation, isn't it? Because he's got to bring down a budget where there's a great deal of pressure to be seen to be doing something to support people on the lowest incomes facing huge cost of living pressures. But the minute you start to do something like that, it's potentially stimulatory, which just puts more and more pressure on inflation. And the Reserve Bank will be looking at those jobs figures. And the indication that they haven't come off, that they've held, which on one level is great, would also suggest there'll be more money circulating than they might have anticipated, and that may put pressure on next month to do it again and raise interest rates again. So it's a complicated beast, the economy, and there is a lot to calculate going into this budget about where the political imperatives lie and the expectations of people and what it will mean for the economy to put more money in the shape of assistance.
Jack, there's clearly a need for a lot of people struggling right now. I mean, yes, the Treasurer's got to balance these things, but it's hard to see him ignoring giving a bit more help.
Yeah, well, there's resources in Aboriginal communities, for starters, that need to come back up to levels that they were before massive cuts by the coalition government in 2013, 2014 sort of period. Aside from that, you see cost of living, particularly rental availability, rental housing availability. Yeah, lots of people, 60 to 80 people turning up, applying for the same place. A lot of people are struggling, and meanwhile, there's still tax cuts for the
Stage 3 tax cuts. Yeah. There's money there for some. All right. Our panel, Karen Middleton, Jack Lattimore and Claire Armstrong, going to be back shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with the former government coach, the one and only former government coach.
Yeah, Mikey, great to be here. Appreciate it.
I know you've been very busy. What have you been doing?
Yeah, actually hitting the road. Sammy, Jane, me and a couple of others.
And you'd be lead though, right?
Oh, very much the main part.
Yeah.
Very much the star here.
Is it difficult to watch your old team? Like they got flogged at the Aston game, they got flogged in New South Wales?
Well, look, I am but a humble commentator, so all I can say is had I still been in charge, would have been a very different result.
Let's have a look at the week. Yep. I'd like your opinion on how the current government's going. When it comes to the voice, Peter Dutton's not really afraid to say what he thinks. He has become the leader of the no-alition.
Very much so. Very much so. It's a big no from him, with the simmerings of yes along the way. Very much yeah, nah.
Beautiful Pat Hudson cartoon. It's kind of the new reality show, isn't it? Love It or Resist It Australia. Renovator's dream. He seems to be stripping the wallpaper.
It's gorgeous. It's pretty brutal there.
Yeah, it is brutal.
Sorry, I am a little bit distracted by the buttocks. It's a little graphic.
Beautiful Mark Knight, who's it's got such a versatile face as Dutton, doesn't he?
Yes.
You can turn him into anything.
Mashed potatoes, scrambled eggs. I mean, the list goes on.
Yeah, an Easter egg, with the people saying, you've got to feel for the poor old Bilby this Easter, as he's towing it along.
Yeah. Not very hidden, though. Normally you hide your Easter eggs and Bilbies, don't you? Yeah. Dutton's out there loud and proud.
Julian Leeser certainly found his voice this week as he stepped down from his front bench position. Would you have tolerated such behaviour when you were coaching?
I've always said we're a very broad church in the Blue Ties, increasingly narrow, to be fair.
The door slams and Susan Lee, you weren't expecting that voice as I quit.
Well, I think it was a very good display of party unity for 47 seconds, and now it's really starting to fall apart, isn't it?
David Pope's done this beautiful cartoon, Shadow Minister on the wall, who is the constitutionally fairest of them all.
This one's broken too, Susan.
Yeah, they all seem to be smashed. Ken White, the Aston by-election. It's not a great time for the Blue Ties, is it?
Well, but you're taking the piss, I can tell. The election is 2 years away, Mike.
Right.
A lot can happen in 2 years.
Beautiful Kadelka, who's got the leader of the no-alition digging his own hole here. Yep. Tips for the opposition leaders: if you find yourself in a bit of a hole, actually you're doing fine, Peter, carry on.
There he goes. I think he's actually down there searching for the soul of the Liberal Party right now. What's going on?
Fiona Katauskas has drawn the fraud church of Peter Dutton.
I'm usually preaching the converted, but this time not everyone's a believer.
Yeah,
Look at
right.
that.
Yeah.
Bad faith and the power of no. Oh, there's zombie vibes again. You know, it's becoming more of a breakaway sort of Thursday afternoon in a scout hall arrangement right now, isn't it? A little session for everyone.
Peter Dutton, not the only one accepting the negative. The Treasurer has been sounding the warning on the economy. Lovely Matt Golding. The economic outlook here is being shielded. Yeah, don't look.
It's just keep on walking. I mean, just keep on walking.
Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, is in Washington at the moment. Beautiful David Pope is channeling Bruce Springsteen. Oh, someday, girl, and I don't know when we're going to get to that place and we'll walk in the sun. But with forecasts like this, baby, we were born to run.
One more time with feeling, Mike Bowers. Come on, together, that last line.
Baby,
we were born to run.
Coach, very sad news this week with the passing of one of Australia's great cartoonists, the wonderful Bruce Petty, who was a regular here in the early days of Insiders. He was an animator, a cartoonist, a satirist. He worked for the New Yorker, Esquire and Punch magazine, the Daily Mirror in Australia, the Bulletin, the Australian, and for 40 years he worked for the Melbourne Age. He won so many awards and he died last week. Our condolences to his family. He'll be missed a great deal.
Full credit to Bruce Petty. Grew up enjoying his work.
He did a wonderful cartoon for me. It's called Bowers Sydney, and here we are filming Talking Pictures with the little ABC crew here.
That is beautiful.
It's just wonderful. We need to take it out.
Should we take the show on the road, Mikey Barr?
I think we should take it on the road.
Give us some Springsteen to bring it home.
Yeah,
because baby, we were born to run. Head back to you, Speersy, you mongrel. Beat that.
Thank you, Sammy J. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations to you first, Claire.
I just wanted to mention a couple of things really quickly. Firstly, Labor Senator Pat Dodson has had to take a leave of absence from Parliament. He's unwell. He's been obviously hugely formative in The Voice and a lot of other Indigenous issues. So just, to hope that he goes okay. Yeah. Also, in tomorrow's News Corp papers, bit of a self-promotion here, I've done an interview with Rosie Smiler. She's the granddaughter of Vincent Lingiari, of very famous in the Australian Indigenous land rights movement. She's focusing on helping her local community in Kalkarinji in the Northern Territory get their heads around The Voice so they understand what it is. She's much more focused inwardly than being out there as a relatively well-known spokesperson in the community. And I think there's going to be a lot of Indigenous people that do take up those little local roles that maybe won't get the coverage that are going to be important.
Spotlight. Yeah, interesting. Jack?
Following on from that, I've got two parts, and it's to do with the treaty process, statewide treaty process here in Victoria. Second iteration of the Assembly, First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, with elections in May. There's a number of members, the whisper is, that may not run again, encouraging Aboriginal community to enrol to vote. Second part of that is the Yoorrook Justice Commission, just about to kick off or get stuck into its inquiry into child protection and criminal justice systems, probing the government bureaucracy. So that will be
That'd be very interesting to watch. Yeah, all right. Karen?
Oh, just very quickly, there was a lot of confusion about whether the Prime Minister was going to go to the NATO summit in July. It seems he is likely to be going to that. I'm not sure where all that confusion came from. Maybe because he was away on holidays. I don't know. But Penny Wong seemed to be suggesting he probably would, and I'm told that is more likely than not that he will attend that in Lithuania in July.
Yes, no, I've heard similar that he probably will be going. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Finally, quitting the front bench is never easy, but it turns out walking away from a shadow ministry was easier for Julian Leeser than walking out the door. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Thanks so much.
Making us all feel very excited about being here.